First thing I want to take care of is the setting of the book of Leviticus. That is to say, where does it fit into the sequence of events that's being described from Exodus on? I mentioned before that if you were translating literally, Leviticus would begin with the word "and." The first word is translated "and he called." Yahweh's calling to Moses, but "and he called," that's one Hebrew word. So it is a continuation of what went before, and the title and the first line indicates that. It's not, the text really doesn't break at the beginning of Leviticus, it's a continuation. But that raises some questions, because we have a place mentioned in Leviticus 1:1. Then Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. We'll look at what he says in just a moment. Just a note on how I'm translating the Tetragrammaton. It's the 4 letters that make up the name of Yahweh. I will sometimes say Lord. My Bible says Lord in all caps. I typically translate it as Yahweh. It's a way of pronouncing those 4 letters of the name of Yahweh. And the reason for saying Yahweh rather than Lord is because it is a proper name. Jesus is the Lord, but the Lord is not Jesus' proper name. The Christ is a title that's given to Jesus as the anointed king, but Christ is not the name of Jesus. His personal name is Hebrew Yeshua, Jesus, Jesus. And in the Old Testament, when God reveals his name to Moses, he reveals a name by which he can be invoked and called. We know God by name, analogous to what you'd have in ancient Greek religion. You don't just have gods, you have gods with names like Jupiter and Hera and Neptune and so on. There is a name to Israel's God. That's what the name Yahweh is. It's a proper name. So the complication in verse 1 is about the tent of meeting that's referred to there. If we're reading straight through, as the text implies, the tent of meeting seems to be the tent of meeting that's just been mentioned in Exodus 40, verse 34. The cloud covered the tent of meeting. And now Yahweh's calling to Moses from the tent of meeting in the beginning of Leviticus. You have a juxtaposition of that phrase, that name of the tabernacle that we've talked about. It seems like it must be the same place. But in terms of the narrative, the immediate narrative, the complication is that Moses just had to run out of that tent of meeting. So how is he being called back in? What's happened between the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus? It doesn't appear anything has happened. How is it that Moses can now enter to receive revelation from Yahweh about the sacrifices after he's been excluded from the sanctuary? The other complication is the very close resemblance between Exodus 40 and Leviticus 8 and 9. Exodus 40 begins with Moses setting up the tabernacle. He puts up the structure of the tabernacle. Then he puts all the furnishings into the tabernacle. Then the cloud comes after the tabernacle is finished and comes down and consecrates the tabernacle with the glory of God. Part of that construction of the tabernacle is the consecration of priests. This is in Exodus 40, verse 12 and following. Then you shall bring Aaron and his sons to the doorway of the tent of meeting. That's the tent of meeting that Moses has just set up. That's the tabernacle. We know that from the preceding verses because it's the furnishings that are put into it have just been described for us. You shall bring Aaron and his sons into the doorway of the tent of meeting and wash them with water. You shall put on the holy garments on Aaron and anoint him and consecrate him that he may priest to me, or minister as priest to me. And you shall bring his sons and put tunics on them. Sorry. And you shall anoint them, even as you anointed their father, that they may priest to me. The word priest is Kohen. That started out being a C, and I turned it to a K, because the K is a better translation. Kohen. Kahan is the verb that's used here to minister as priest or to priest, to be a priest. So you shall anoint them even as you anointed their father, that they may preach to me, and their anointing shall qualify them for perpetual priesthood throughout their generations. Okay. So Exodus 40 describes construction of the tabernacle and then consecration of priests. And then if that's happened in chapter 40, then we get to the beginning of Leviticus, and if Leviticus is immediately following that, if we just read it in chronological sequence, then the priests are already ordained when Leviticus 1 has happened, Moses is maybe back in the tabernacle because the priests have been ordained. The problem is that Leviticus 8 and 9 describe the ordination and consecration of priests in great detail. It's a much longer passage. It's two full chapters, and then Nadab and Abihu offer strange fire and ruin it all. 2 full chapters about the ordination and the consecration of priests in Leviticus 8 and 9, summarized in a handful of verses in Exodus 40. And Leviticus 9 in particular ends with this scene. After all of the rites of ordination, they've been anointed, been washed, they've been vested with their garments, they've been anointed, they've offered a series of sacrifices, they've stayed in the courtyard of the tent of meeting for 7 days, they've gone through the rituals of the 8th day of the ordination process, and now finally Aaron is fully priest. And verse 22 of chapter 9 says, Aaron lifted up his hands toward the people and blessed them, and he stepped down after making the sin offering and the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, and when they came out and blessed the people, the glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people, and the fire came out from before Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of the fat on the altar, and all the people saw it, and they shouted and fell on their faces. The glory of the Lord appears. Chapter 9 is describing in more detail things that are described in less detail in chapter 40 of Exodus. Did that happen twice? Something is out of chronological order. Either Exodus 40 is anticipating something that's going to be told more elaborately later on in Leviticus, or something else has displaced it. Because you have 2 accounts of the ordination of the priests, 2 accounts of the descent of the glory of the Lord in Exodus, at the end of Exodus, and then in Leviticus 8 and 9. My solution is this, that as I mentioned to Michael this morning, he brought up the tent of meeting that's described in Exodus 33. Moses sets this up in the aftermath of the golden calf incident, when the Lord is threatening to abandon Israel. He's threatening to wipe all the Israelites out and start over a new people with Moses. And Moses persuades him not to do that. And then Moses sets up a tent of meeting outside the camp, and the Lord speaks to him there, and he brings revelation from there to Israel, and people can go out and consult with the Lord there. I think that's the tent of meeting that's being described at the beginning of Leviticus. So I think you have Exodus 40 is anticipating something that's going to be told in more detail in Leviticus 8 and 9, and then these the sacrifices are hearkening back to the earlier tent of meeting, and not the tent of meeting that is the tabernacle. So a couple of things a couple of effects that it has on the way we read the opening chapters of Leviticus. If that's the case, if what I've said is the case, then the instructions that are given in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus are instructions about sacrifices that haven't been performed yet. Some of them have been performed in some fashion, but the elaborated instructions have not yet been given, and they aren't put into full implementation until the ordination of priests. That's the first time we see the sacrificial system fully operational in Leviticus. It also sets up the dynamic that I mentioned earlier, and that is the cliffhanger that's at the end of Exodus. Can Moses get back into the tabernacle? Can anybody get back into the tabernacle? The reason why Exodus ends on that cliffhanger, even though it's jumping ahead in time, is because it's establishing that theme of, and then the Lord's instructions about sacrifices are about the overcoming of that exclusion. Okay, that all kind of makes sense. In other words, I don't think it, in terms of literary movement, end of Exodus immediately goes into Leviticus. Grammatically, that's how it works. I think in terms of the actual series of events, what is given in Leviticus is either sometime before Exodus 40 is everything in Exodus 40 happens, because the tabernacle is not yet set up. Moses is still meeting in his personal tent, and the priests are not yet ordained. Okay, not a lot stands or falls on that, but I think that's the best way to overcome that. I think part of this also has to do. One of the ways to answer the question is just in terms of what is Moses' function in this whole setup. He's led the people out of Egypt. He's brought them to Sinai. He's the mediator of the Sinai covenant. But he is the one constructing the system, not the one who's going to be running it. And in that sense, he's functioning as a prophet. Prophets are one of the functions of prophets is to they see visions, they communicate those visions to the people. They hear instruction from the Lord and they communicate those instructions. They see a tabnet, tabnet's up there, the pattern. They see the pattern on the mountain, and then they tell the people how to realize the pattern on earth. So, in terms of the sanctuary system, prophets are architects. They're the ones with the plans. They don't build the temple. Moses does. So Moses is doubling up. He's serving in all kinds of capacities. But if you, Ezekiel climbs to the top of a mountain. He sees this vision of a great temple. He's not going to build that, but he does see the vision and communicates to the people. David receives the vision in a prophetic capacity, the blueprints of the temple, and the King Solomon builds it, and then priests are in charge of the operations. So Moses is the prophetic figure, and the tabernacle is set up to continue as a place of meeting at the dwelling of Yahweh in Moses' absence. After Moses is gone, the covenant that he's established through his prophetic ministry is still there. Okay. All right. Let me give at least a general outline of the book of Leviticus. It would have been better had I provided written outline, but I'll have to do this. So Leviticus is divided into 39 speeches. I mentioned that the section of Exodus from 25 to 31 is divided into seven speeches that begin, Yahweh spoke to Moses saying. That organizing structural pattern continues throughout Leviticus, and the Lord speaks to Moses 39 separate speeches. The Lord spoke to Moses saying occurs 39 times. Those speeches don't correspond necessarily to the chapter divisions of Leviticus. So it's important to pay attention to the structure of speeches as an organizing, and not just to the chapter divisions. The chapter divisions are not necessarily the way the text is originally organized. Just an example of that, we'll make something of this later, but the first three chapters of Leviticus form a single speech. They cover three separate offerings, which is why there are three separate chapters in our Bibles, but it's all one speech, and we should think of them not just as separate offerings, but why would they be part of one speech? What is the pattern that's going on in the one speech? On the other hand, you have chapters 6 and 7, which are divided into a series of 6 or 7 different speeches, shorter speeches. So there are 39 of those. This is structurally significant because the central speech, which would be the 19th, did I say 39? I think I mean 37. 37 speeches. There are 18 speeches on either side of chapter 16. Chapter 16 is the Day of Atonement. Okay, it is 37, not 39. I misspoke. 37 speeches. You put that in the margin of your Bibles, and then I had to correct it. 37 speeches. The central speech is the Day of Atonement. I mean, that's we could kind of read through
Special speech is what?
the middle speech, which is the 19th speech, with 18 on either side of it. That's in chapter 16. So we could read through Leviticus and think, well, the obvious, really big deal of Leviticus is the Day of Atonement. That's a really, really big event, which it is. And we'll spend some time talking about it tomorrow or Thursday. Excuse me. But the structure by the speeches highlights that as the central speech. A simpler way to organize it, or another way to organize it, is to see this in terms of different thematic sections, and it forms a chiasm. Have you all studied chiasms at all? Been introduced to chiasms? I'll put this outline up, and then I'll talk about it a little bit. Chapters 1 through 7 are the laws about offerings. That's rules for different sorts of offerings in the first 5 or so chapters, and then chapters 6 and 7 are rules for distribution of the byproducts or the leftovers of the offerings. Who gets to eat what, or who gets to keep what. Okay. Those are all. That section is all about offerings. It's a fairly obvious section. The second section is about the priests. In chapters 8 through 10, that's the ordination of priests. In chapters 8 and 9, chapter 8 is the initial day of the ordination rite, and then it ends with instructions about staying in the sanctuary for a week. And then chapter 9 details the 8th day rituals for the ordination of priests. Just as a hint of what's to come, what else happens on the 8th day in the Old Testament? What's the big obvious thing that happens on the 8th day? Well, possibly. It does. Yes, the resurrection is described as the day after the Sabbath, which is the first day of a new week, or the 8th day sometimes. Circumcision is what I was looking for. Circumcision is the 8th day after birth for Israelite boys. And that will be part of the background for the ordination of priests. There's a connection between every Israelite boy who is circumcised in the flesh and incorporated into Israel by virtue of circumcision, and what happens to the priests. It's an elevated kind of circumcision into a new kind of priestly ministry. Okay. So anyway, that was a preview of what's to come. Letter C. They're purity rules, or probably better to say that impurity rules, things that make you unclean, unfit to be in God's presence. What makes you unclean? Eating unclean foods, touching the carcasses of unclean animals. That makes you unclean. Having a baby, we don't have to worry about that, but our wives do. In the Old Testament, if you had a baby, which is commanded by God, be fruitful and multiply, the result of that is the woman is unclean for 40 or 80 days, depending on the sex of the child. If you have skin disease, it's often called leprosy. If you have skin disease, a mark on your body that where the hair in the mark is discolored, and the mark is deeper than the skin, it's like a puncture or a depression in your skin, especially if the flesh underneath the skin is showing through, you're unclean. And in certain cases, I don't think in every case, but in certain cases, you can't stay in the camp. You have to go outside the camp, or later on outside the city. if you are a man and you have emissions from your penis, genital emissions, that makes you unclean. Even if it's perfectly legitimate sexual activity in a marriage, that makes you unclean. Makes your wife unclean too. She's unclean every time she has a period. Every month she's unclean for the time of her period, and then for a time after that until the purification takes place. If she has a flow of blood for a longer period of time, then she's unclean throughout that time of flowing blood. So these are emissions, but they're called emissions from the flesh, but they're specifically emissions from the genitals, from the sexual organs. So those are the main categories of impurity that we'll look at in chapters 11 through 15. The center in this structure is the central speech, which is Day of Atonement. That's detailed in chapter 16 of Leviticus. Corresponding to the purity rules, we have a series of chapters that we can categorize. This is the only thing that's dealt with. But defilements of the land. I talked about this earlier today. Defilements of the land. Sexual sins can defile the land. If Israel worships idols, it defiles the land. If Israel fills the land with innocent blood, they defile the land. And chapters 17 through 20 are detailing some of those. B prime, the corresponding section to chapters 8 through 10, is regulations concerning the priests, rules of priesthood. That's in chapters 21 and 22. But I'm going... Priesthood. Sorry. I'm going to extend that. I turned my pen into an eraser. There we go. That's 21 to 24 extends beyond rules of priesthood. Chapters 21 and 22 are rules concerning the priesthood. Can you attend your sister's funeral, for instance? Depends on where you stand in the priestly hierarchy. If you're a hunchback, can you serve as priest? If you've got a withered limb, can you serve as a priest? The answer in both cases is no, because you have to be physically a full and perfect specimen as a human to serve as priest, just like the sacrifices have to be without blemish to be acceptable to God on the altar. Priests and sacrifices are linked up in those two chapters of 21 and 22. Chapter 23 is the schedule of festivals, the times of appointment. The annual starts with Sabbath day, which is a weekly time of appointment, and then the annual cycle of feasts is in the rest of chapter 23. And then chapter 24 is a narrative section that has to do with a man who blasphemes within the camp, and Moses has to consult with the Lord to determine what to do with the blasphemer in the camp. And then the last section, corresponding to the offerings, starts with the Jubilee. That says Jubilee. And ends with things consecrated. Okay, chapters 25 through 27. All right. That has some correlations. The correlation with the offerings is not perfect, but it has some correlations with that. Especially the last chapter, chapter 27, is all about things that have been devoted to the Lord. You can devote animals to the Lord. You can devote property, real property to the Lord. But then what if you want it back after you've said, I'm going to give this to the Lord? In some circumstances, you can't get it back, but in most circumstances, you can reclaim the property, but you have to pay a penalty to reclaim it, and it has a schedule of what you have to pay in order to receive the property back that you've given over to the Lord. So in a chiastic structure like this, it sounds like most of you have already encountered chiasms. The chiastic structure like this, the corresponding sections share certain details, share certain themes, and you can see some of that evident in the labels I've given to this different sections. There are also some other indications that these sections are legitimate divisions within the text. One has to do with the mentions of Sinai. They're camped at Sinai, and Sinai has been a prominent theme in the book of Exodus, of course, but Sinai is mentioned only twice in the entire book of Leviticus. One is right here at the end of chapter 7. It's right at the end of the legislation about sacrifices, right before you go into the legislation about priests, and you have mention of Sinai. The other is at the beginning of chapter 25. It's 25:1. So a very rare reference in the book of Leviticus, placed at strategic places in the structure, which marks off the first 7 chapters. They end with a reference to Sinai. The last 3 chapters begin with reference to Sinai, and the references to Sinai work as brackets around the intervening chapters, which is chapters 8 through 24. That forms a section, a unit, with the references to Sinai surrounding it. Okay. Another supporting detail for this outline is to notice where the narrative sections of Leviticus fall. There aren't many narrative sections in Leviticus. There's a lot of narrative background, as we'll see. You have to have Genesis and Exodus, have to have those stories in mind to interpret what's going on in Leviticus. I think Leviticus assumes that you have Genesis and Exodus in mind. It doesn't do a lot of explanation, and the way to unravel some of the mysteries of Leviticus is to see them in the light of those earlier narratives. But there aren't many specifically narrative sections. The 2 narrative sections in Leviticus are in the B sections, B and B prime. The first one is the fall of the priests in chapter 10. That says fall of priests. And then there's the one that I just mentioned in chapter 24, the blasphemer. Some similarities between those 2 episodes. Both of them are kind of fall scenes. Nadab and Abihu in chapter 10 bring strange fire to the Lord, and they get burned by fire that breaks out against them. The blasphemer is a fall not in the sanctuary, but it's in the camp. So there's a sin in the camp that corresponds to the sin in the sanctuary in chapter 10, sin in the camp. In both cases, you have a narrative that closes out a section. So in the B section, 8 and 9 are instruction about the ordination rite. Chapter 10 is the fall scene. That's the more overtly narrative section. And then in chapters 20 through 24 is chapter 24, the conclusion of that B prime section. That's the narrative. So you have correlations not just with similar concerns with priesthood, but with genre. That's where the narratives fit in. One last indication is a phrase that is placed at the beginning of section C and at the end of section C prime. Let me read those. These are similar statements of the role of priests. This is after Nadab and Abihu have fallen, and what the Lord tells the priests that they have to do. And I'll read another passage in chapter 11, but this is preceding the C section. Do not drink wine or strong drink, nor shall your sons with you when you come into the tent of meeting, so that you may not die. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, so as to teach the sons of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them through Moses. So that's in chapter 10. Chapter 11 ends with this. This is the Torah regarding the animal, the bird, every living thing that moves in the waters, everything that swarms on earth, to make a distinction between unclean and clean, and between the edible creatures and the creature which is not to be eaten. Okay. There's a little more specificity to that. It's at the end of the chapter that's dealing with unclean foods, and it talks about distinguishing between clean and unclean, specifically with regard to food. The other passage in chapter 10 is more general, but you have those two references to distinguishing between clean and unclean, between holy and profane, that are at the end of the B section, the beginning of the C section. Now, at the end of the C prime section, the very end of chapter 20, we have a reiteration of that. Chapter 20, as I said, is largely about sexual sins and the punishment for sexual sins, which is frequently death penalty for all sorts of sexual crimes. But then at the end of that, the Lord says, you are therefore to make a distinction between the clean animal and the unclean. Suddenly we're back to clean and unclean animals. That was the concern of chapter 11 way back then. Now it's being brought up again at the end of chapter 20. Between the unclean bird and the clean, you shall not make yourselves detestable by animal, by bird, or by anything that creeps on the ground, which I have separated to you as unclean. Thus you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy. I have set you apart among the nations to be mine. Okay. So that concludes chapter 20, and it's a statement about distinguishing unclean and unclean specifically with regard to animals. So what you have in the end of the B, the beginning of the C section, are general instructions about distinguishing between clean and unclean, and specific instructions in chapter 11 to distinguish between clean and unclean animals. Then at the end of chapter 20, you have a reiteration of that same instruction to distinguish between clean and unclean animals. Pardon me. Okay. So those references, again, like the references to Sinai, the references to Sinai bracket off chapters 8 through 24 as one long unit. Within that, you have chapters 11 through 20 bracketed off by these general instructions about clean and unclean at the beginning and end of the section. So in some sense, chapters 11 through 20 hang together as a section. And then within that, 11 through 20, the Day of Atonement is clearly bisecting bisecting two sections, one of them having to do with purity and the other one having to do with land defilements. So within this large section of 11 through 20, which is framed by references to clean and unclean and the need to distinguish between them, that's what unifies that long section. Right in the middle of that, you have chapter 16, which divides between the section about sanctuary purity and then the section about land purity. Okay. That all making some kind of sense? You understand why I'm citing these particular verses, because they're playing a structural role in Leviticus and helping us to break up Leviticus into recognizable or digestible sections. Yeah, well, I think my argument is partly that it's for a structural reason, is to bind those sections together. The fact that it goes back to clean and unclean animals, I think, indicates that in some sense the purity laws are still in play when he's talking about sexual sins. And that draws out an analogy, this related to what I said this morning, an analogy between what happens at the sanctuary and what is happening in the land. So the clean and unclean foods pertains primarily to what's happening in the sanctuary, but the land laws include that same instruction, which means that there's this connection between land and sanctuary. I think that would be part of it. I'm sure I'm missing some rationale for that, but that would be my answer to the question. All right. As introduction to the system of offerings, I'm going to give you a series of pro tips. I'm a professional. I get paid to write theology. All right, pro tips. I'm a professional. So my pro tips are these. I can even put these on the screen. Look at this. I can write them down so that you can remember them if I can find my pen. There it is. Pro tip number 1. You want to understand, that says think. Want to understand the tabernacle and the sacrificial system, think back. There are 2 whole books prior to Leviticus. And that is preparation for and background for what's happening in Leviticus. And we need that, as I've already alluded, as I already intimated. We need that background because Leviticus doesn't tell us much of anything about why things are done the way they are done. You don't get instructions about why the ascension offering or the whole burnt offering is done the way it is. You just get things like this. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd or an ascension offering from the herd, he shall offer it a male without defect, who shall offer it at the door of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him to make atonement on his behalf. He shall save the son of the herd from before the Lord, and Aaron's sons the priest shall offer up the blood and sprinkle the blood around on the altar that is the doorway of the tent of meeting. He shall then skin the burnt offering and cut into its pieces, and the sons of Aaron the priest shall put the fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire, and Aaron's sons the priest shall arrange the pieces, the head, and the suet over the wood which is on the fire, which is on the altar, or in the altar. Its entrails are ever, and its legs you shall wash with water, and the priest shall offer up in smoke all of it on the altar for an ascension offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. Okay. Why? Why any of that? Why do you have to wash some parts and not others? Why are the specific parts designated to be put on the altar? Why a male, a son, and a son of the herd? Herd is bovines, cows. Flock is ovines, sheep and caprines, goats. Herds and flocks. This is a son from the herd. You can get flock animals too for an ascension offering, with very little variation. Why the blood put on the sides of the altar? Why is any of this being done? What's the point of it? We're not told. Nowhere in Leviticus are we given detailed instructions about why things are done the way they are done in these rituals of sacrifice. In order to get some hint of that, we have to think back, among other things, we have to think back to the narrative precursors to the offerings that are being described here. I think there are several. In order to see how this works, though, I need to state a general assumption, general conclusion, I should say, about sacrifice. And that is that sacrifice is a ritual of death and transfiguration. A ritual of death and transfiguration. When we think of sacrifice, I think our instinct is to think an animal's being killed, foreshadowing Jesus being killed and putting to death on the cross for our sake, substituting for us, bearing the wrath and the curse of God for us. If you took an animal into the tabernacle and slaughtered it and walked away, you would not yet have done a sacrifice. That's not the end of the sacrificial procedure. You bring an animal into the tabernacle courts, You lean your hand on the head of the animal. You slaughter the animal. And then something has to be done with the blood. And something has to be done with the flesh. The flesh is cut up into pieces. And certain pieces are going to put on the altar, and certain pieces are going to go elsewhere. And the first parts that are put on the altar are going to be turned to smoke. That's a sacrifice. Not just the death of the animal, but everything from the presentation of the animal in the tabernacle courts all the way through the transformation of the animal into smoke. Okay. And the smoke that's going to ascend to the Lord as soothing aroma to the Lord. Okay. The animal is entering into the fire that Yahweh started. How did the fire start? We read at the end of Leviticus 9. We'll look back at this again. But Leviticus 9 tells us that the fire on the altar starts when the fire of the Lord bursts out and lights up the altar fire. This is Yahweh's fire. It comes directly from the glory that's inside the tabernacle. It's Yahweh's fire in the altar. You can't let it go out, right? And stoke it up again the next day. That's not the way it's supposed to work. It's Yahweh's fire, and Yahweh's fire has to be kept going. The animals being put into Yahweh's fire, already dead, already dismembered, in order to be translated into another form, into smoke. Okay. And he goes down into the altar in order to rise. He goes down to the altar and to be transformed to smoke that can go up to the Lord, to ascend. Okay. So, with that in mind, the basic scheme of sacrifice in the Bible is death, dismemberment that leads to transfiguration and reunion. Okay, that's the whole movement of sacrifice. And once we get a grasp on that, then we begin to see sequences throughout the Bible that are similar to sacrificial procedures. The creation account. What is God doing on the first 3 days of creation? Well, skip the first day for my purposes. What is he doing on the second day of creation? What kind of world exists at the beginning of day 2 of creation? There's light and dark, but it's all water. And what he does on day 2 of the creation week is separate the waters above and below and put the firmament between the two. There's a separation of waters that puts the waters above and below into a connection with each other, but it's an act of separation and a kind of dismemberment of the world as it then existed. The day 3, he does the same thing again with water. Creation is a hydraulics project. God is moving water around. He separates the water that's on the earth so the dry land can emerge. And he puts dry land and sea into a particular relationship with each other. So in the creation account, you have the beginnings of what looks something like a sacrificial procedure of something whole, the watery earth, being torn in two, separated, reorganized and reshaped so that it is now the waters above and waters below aren't supposed to collapse together again. They do in the flood. They're supposed to be kept separated, but they're in a kind of relationship with each other, a kind of union with each other. Creation itself has a kind of sacrificial structure to it. The creation of Eve, I think, especially does. What happens to Adam? It's not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him. There's some dust here. I'm going to take some dust. I formed Adam from the dust. I molded him to the shape of a man. Then I breathed the breath of life into his nostrils, and he became a living soul. I think I'll do it again, except this time I'll make a woman. Why not? Or why couldn't he just say, let there be a woman? Could have. As he said, let there be light. What he does is a very complicated kind of procedure, an odd kind of thing, where he puts Adam into a deep sleep, a state that's near death. He tears him in pieces. Don't think rib, one bone. The word that's translated as rib in Genesis 2 is never elsewhere translated as rib. It mostly describes architectural features especially of the temple, and it's a side chamber of the temple. The word really means side, or it's a slope, a side of a mountain. I think the better picture is not that one bone is being taken from Adam, but kind of half his rib cage. He's being torn in pieces while he's asleep. Okay. And then that side of Adam, the Lord sews up his flesh, closes the flesh, and that side of Adam he builds into a woman and then brings the woman to the man, and they are to become one flesh. What's happened there is you've had a singular man. He's by himself, has no companion. The companion is made by a deep sleep, a separation into two individuals, but they're two individuals that are supposed to reunite in a new and more glorious kind of union, a fruitful union, a union that can produce more human beings. Right? The creation of Eve is a kind of sacrificial sequence, kind of sacrificial action that the Lord performs on Adam. One hint of this in the text itself of Genesis 2. Adam is created Adam. Why is he Adam? Why is that his name? Because he's taken from the Adamah, which is the ground. He's named by his origin. He's taken from the ground and he's called by his groundling. He's earthling. If you wanted to translate more, capture the dynamic in Hebrew, the Adamah is the ground from which Adam is formed. Okay. Eve is not the feminine form of Adam. That would be Adamah. That would be the ground. She's not the feminine form. She's called Isha because she's taken from the man who is now called Ish. Adam gets a new name when he's split in two and is given a companion. Adam gets a new name, which is transliterated as Ish. The woman, Isha. Like Adam, her first name, she's given a later name, Mother, or Eve, because she's the mother of all the living. Chava. Eve is just as a name form of the word for life. But her first name is Isha because she's taken from the man. The man is called Adam because he's taken from the Adamah. The woman is called Isha because she's taken from the Ish. Okay. The curious thing here that's relevant to Leviticus is that same set of consonants, Isha, is the word that's used for the altar portions of a sacrifice. In the Hebrew, it's transliterated as Isha. You notice the E is different. The vowel is different at the end. It's not the same word because of that vowel. But if you think you're aware probably that the original Hebrew text did not have vowel pointing in it. The vowel pointing is added later by scribes. So the original Hebrew text is just a string of consonants. If you saw the woman Isha was given to the man Ish, she's called woman Ish because she was taken from the, she's called woman Isha because she was taken from the man. If you saw that in Genesis 2, read along, you get to Leviticus 1, and you say, and the Isha is put on the altar as the Lord's portion of the sacrifice. You don't know that there's any difference at all if you don't have the vowels. And the vowels, the vowel pointing is put in partly to distinguish between these two uses of this basic consonantal term. So, if you there's a link. I think there's a theological link between the woman who is brought to the man and the sacrificial portions that are brought to the Lord. We're supposed to think of those two things in tandem with each other. I will translate, when we get to it, talking about Leviticus, I will usually translate the phrase the word isha as bridal food. In the most English translations, you have various translations. Sometimes it's translated as offering by fire. The reason it was translated offering by fire is because of a link with the Hebrew word for fire, which is ish. You can see perhaps an etymological link between ish, man, isha, sacrificial food, ish, fire offering by fire. Sometimes isha is translated as food offering. Both of those are true because the isha, the altar portions, are put into the fire, and the altar portions are put into the fire as Yahweh's bread. So those capture something that's true about the altar portions. The word itself, it seems to me, is more closely linked to the word for woman. And the implication of that is, if we look at the sacrificial system in the light of Genesis 2, what we have is a procedure, a sacrificial procedure, that turns the animal into bridal portions for Yahweh. You bring the animal so that you can unite as bride to your husband, your divine husband, who is Yahweh. Another way to say this from a New Testament perspective is the sacrifices are a marriage, a continuous marriage feast between Yahweh and his people. Every time they come for an appointment, they are having a date. Catching on? Okay, you're talking your language. Yeah. The worshiper is bringing something. He's a member of the bride, and he's bringing bridal food, and there's a continuous marriage feast that's going on at the tabernacle. Okay. All right. That might seem a stretch to you. That's okay. You don't have to believe that. How about this, though? Still in the book of Genesis, a couple other things in Genesis 2 and 3 that set the background for sacrifice. If you ask Jonathan Edwards, when was the first sacrifice? What would he say? What would Jonathan Edwards say? Jonathan Edwards would say the first sacrifice was in Genesis 3, when Yahweh provided animal skins to replace the fig leaves that Adam and Eve had made, the fig leaf aprons that Adam and Eve had made to cover their shame, to cover their nakedness. Okay. The Lord provides animal skins. This is not just Jonathan Edwards. It goes way back to, I think, Gregory of Nyssa, and maybe even earlier. This is a very ancient reading of that verse in Genesis 3, that the animal skins are skins. God didn't say, let there be animal skins so that I can cover them. But the Lord is the one who offers the first sacrifice. The first slaughter of an animal is Yahweh slaughtering the animal to provide coverings for his sinful, shameful creatures. That sets a pattern for understanding what sacrifice is. What happens at that point in Genesis 3? One thing that happens is that Adam and Eve are being stripped and divested of the clothing they made for themselves, the inadequate clothing that doesn't really hide their shame. They're being divested, and then they're being reinvested. They're given new clothing, a new covering provided by Yahweh that's going to cover them, cover their shame. It's going to cover them in the sense of giving them a kind of status. Covering and robes and garments in the Bible are frequently markers of status, or as markers of elevation, office. Joseph keeps getting new robes, and they keep getting stripped off of him. His father gives him a robe, makes him preeminent over his brothers. That gets stripped off of him. He has a robe in Potiphar's house. He's the chief steward of Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife rips that robe off him. He goes down into the prison, and then he comes out of the prison, and he's given his final set of robes that designate him as chief over the entire the entire famine relief project, the forced saving project, if you will, the Social Security project that protects Egypt from the famine. Okay, the office, the robe designates his office, and there's a kind of glorification and elevation that the Lord is providing by giving them animal skins. There's just the fact of covering. That's I've already said that the Lord is covering their shame. I'm still here. I don't know if you can see me, but I'm still here. The Lord is covering their shame and their sin. That concept of covering, I think I've said this. Yeah, I have said this already. That concept of covering is the basic meaning of the verb that is translated as atone or make atonement. The verb is kafar. I had that on here somewhere. Well, I'm not showing up anymore. The verb is kafar. That's the verb that's make atonement, and the Lord is providing a covering for Adam and Eve. That's what the sacrifices are going to do. I think you can bring the marital imagery that I've already described into this. Insofar as sacrifice provides the Lord's covering for his people or for his worshiper, it's a kind of marital image, the robe, the wing of the Lord's garment being stretched over his people. He's provided covering because he's bringing them into communion with himself as members of his bride. So Genesis 3 and the coverings of animal skins are in the background of the sacrificial offerings. We need to think back to Genesis 2 and 3. Yeah. Okay, so there I got kafar. That's the verb that means atone. Okay, so you got Genesis 3. That image from Genesis 3 is part of the background to the sacrificial system. Another detail of Genesis 3, I think, is crucial background. I've already mentioned it today, and that's the cherubim. Excuse me. The cherubim who are stationed at the gate of the garden to prevent re-entry into the garden. I said sometime earlier today that if Adam tried to storm the gate of Eden, he would have met a quick demise. What would have happened to him? He would have been chopped into bits by a sword and burned. Okay. Maybe, since Adam can't get into the garden past the cherubim without being killed, maybe he can let somebody go in for him who will be chopped to bits and burned. And then when the cherubim are busy with that, he can sneak in. Maybe that'll work. I don't mean all of that literally, but you have fire and sword at the gate of the garden, which are the implements of sacrifice. If you want to get back into the garden, you've got to pass by fire and sword. You can't do it without dying. So the Lord generously, graciously provides substitutes for you who do go through sword and fire. The animals are sliced, killed, dismembered with the sword, with the knife. They're placed into the fire and they're turned to smoke. That doesn't happen to you. You survive that, and you find yourself standing in the courts of the Lord because the animal has suffered everything that you were supposed to suffer. Okay. So that's another aspect of the Levitical system as a return to Eden. Sacrifices are a way of making your way past the cherubim in order to stand before the Lord and commune with him. Back into the garden, back into communion with the Lord, back into a place of festivity. The original Eden place of festivity and now the tabernacle. Okay, we're still thinking back. So far we've thought back to Eden, but we can also think back to other sacrificial events prior to Leviticus that help shed light on what's happening in Leviticus and the sacrifices of Leviticus. One of the most prominent of these, of course, is Genesis 22. What happens in Genesis 22? That's not a rhetorical question. Yeah. Abraham is supposed to sacrifice Isaac. Waited decades for this son. Finally, the Lord has kept his promise. And now the Lord wants him back. Okay, this is the supreme act of obedience on Abraham's part. The supreme acknowledgement that Isaac is Yahweh's gift to Abraham. And if Yahweh wants him back, then it came from Abraham, goes back to came from Yahweh, goes back to Yahweh. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. I think the other thing that's going on in Abram's mind might be something like this. Sarah's womb was dead. She'd never had a child. She's 90 years old. She's not going to have a baby. But she does, which means that Isaac's conception is already a resurrection. It's life coming in a dead womb. Isaac's birth is a kind of resurrection event. So Hebrews says that Abraham expected, or Abraham went confident that the Lord could restore Isaac. And I think that's, I can imagine Abraham thinking about, where did Isaac come from? Yeah, the Lord will give me Isaac back somehow. I don't know how it'll happen, but the Lord will give me Isaac back. Okay. So that's in the background. Genesis 22 is in the background in the sense that offerings are offerings of sons. What you're offering on the altar in Genesis, now I finally get to Leviticus 1. I emphasized in verse 5 of chapter 1, he shall slay the son of the herd before Yahweh. Sonship language is not invariably, but it's often used to describe sacrificial animals. Every time it refers to a young pigeon, it's a son of a pigeon. Whenever you have the phrase young, here in my translation says young bull, but the phrase in the Hebrew is son of a bull, son of a pigeon. I think occasionally you have flock animals that are described as sons. You're bringing a representative of your son. You're an Abraham. Every time you come into the sanctuary, you're an Abraham. The Lord is, as he did on Mount Moriah, the Lord has graciously provided a substitute for your son who can take that punishment. And Abraham is giving up his entire future. It's not just Isaac, his beloved son, that he's giving up. The promise is at stake. The covenant promise is that your seed will bless all the nations of the earth. Your seed will be like the stars of the heavens and like the sand on the seashore. And if I kill my only son, it's not going to happen. The entire future of the Abrahamic promise is at stake when Abraham goes up to Mount Moriah. And that's the kind of context for sacrifice. You have a substitute son in the form of a son of the herd that's being offered. And your future is being redeemed by the Lord's gracious provision of a ram or another animal, a son of the herd or son of the flock, as the Lord did on Mount Moriah. Okay, the animal that Abraham ultimately sacrifices is specifically a substitute for Isaac, a substitute for his son. That's what's happening in the sacrificial system. One last one. Watch me. Watch me. Yes. Yes. Mikey's going to be so proud of me. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Clearly in the background, that's a P, Passover. Clearly in the background of the sacrificial system is the delivering event of the Exodus. The angel of death, aroused by the blood of Israelite children, the angel of death is taking vengeance against Egypt. This is what Moses warned when he first got to Egypt. He said to Pharaoh, you took my son. This is Yahweh's words. You took my son, Yahweh's son. I'm going to take your son. And that's what the angel of death is doing on the night of Passover. So again, it's a substitute, an offering substituted for a son. I think that one of the things that where Passover feeds into the sacrificial system as a whole is in the use of blood and the importance of a display of blood in the sacrificial system. If you go back to my hypothetical scenario where you're offering a sacrifice, you bring your animal in, you lay your head on the animal, you slice the animal's throat, you kill him, blood is spilled, and then you walk away. You don't have a sacrifice yet. In fact, the blood isn't even finished. Blood is always not only shed, but displayed. And the Passover explains why. At the Passover, if you killed the animal, the Passover lamb or the Passover goat, and didn't put blood on the doorway, your firstborn son is going to die. The blood has to be displayed to the angel of death as a propitiation of the angel of death. A display of blood, I think, with the display of blood is announcing that blood is life. The shedding of blood is obviously death, blood, a life being drained out. If you display blood, you're saying a death has already taken place here, a substitute death. A son has already died here. There's nothing for you to do, angel of death, here, because the son has already died inside this house. And that's what's happening on the altar every time an offering is made. Somewhere on the altar, blood is being poured or splashed or smeared so that there's a display of blood before the Lord, who is the avenger of blood. And a death has taken place. Again, the animal is taking the place of the worshiper. If he displays his own blood, not really going to help anyway. But if he displays his own blood, then he's not going to be able to stand before the Lord and enjoy the festivity of the Lord. But the Lord has provided animals and animal blood to substitute that display before his face and turn away wrath. Okay. There's other things that we could talk about in Genesis and Exodus that would feed into our understanding of sacrifice. But that's what I mean by think back. Pro tip number 2. I think I have 5 of them, maybe just 4. Think back. Think ahead. You think back to the narrative setting from Genesis and Exodus that help to explain the different parts of the sacrificial rituals, why the sacrifices are being made at all, why you need them. And then you think ahead. I'm thinking specifically in Leviticus, you have to look ahead from the instructions at the beginning of the book to later parts of Leviticus to understand how these sacrifices are being used. Let me give some examples. Leviticus 1 is about what's called the whole burnt offering. I'm going to call it the ascension offering for reasons I'll explain. That's one offering. Why? When do you offer an ascension offering? Who knows? Doesn't tell us in Leviticus 1. Leviticus 4 is about the purification offering or sin offering. That gives us some indication of the occasion. If a person sins unintentionally in any of the things which the Lord has commanded not to be done, commits any of them, then he's to offer a purification or sin offering. Okay? That gives us a little bit of hint of when we have to do this. But we're not given much detail of when these offerings are required. Think about this practically. Does Leviticus 4 require me to offer an animal every time that I commit a sin? Okay. Think about Israel camping, finally entering the land, inheriting the land. They're scattered all over the land. Some people are living way up in Dan, the tribe of Dan. That's who's living way up in Dan. It's the tribe of Dan living way up in the Danite territory. They're hundreds of miles, I don't know how many miles, but they're miles and miles and miles from the tabernacle. Is Yahweh expecting them to travel from Dan? Remember, at best they're riding on animals or maybe have some kind of wheeled transport, but it's not quick. And you've got to take an animal and keep it unblemished for hundreds of miles until you get to the tabernacle every time you sin? Well, you do that, and then you head back and you sin on the way back. And when you get back home, you immediately have to grab another animal and start again. Pretty soon, you're going to deplete your flocks and herds. You're not going to have many animals left. And you're going to spend all your time going back and forth to the tabernacle. Is that what the Lord expects? Well, that seems very unreasonable, does it not? The unreasonableness of the system may be part of the point. This is, I think, part of the import of Hebrews. The law can't do it. Because the only way the law could do it is if I spent my entire life offering sacrifices. I can't do that. I can't do that and also obey God's other commandments. I'm supposed to take care of my family, raise my kids. And if I'm spending all my time traveling back and forth to the tabernacle, I can't obey those other commandments. So the law has this kind of built-in impossibility. I think that's part of the point. I think it's also the case that the purification offering is specified, explicitly specified in certain limited number of cases. And mostly have to do with the purification from various forms of uncleanness. We'll see this when we get to chapters 11 through 15. Purification offerings are offered, specifically prescribed to be offered in those kinds of circumstances. But you don't know that when you get to Leviticus 4. You don't know what it's for, when you offer it, how often you have to offer it. You don't know anything about when you offer the ascension offering, the whole burnt offering. It gives you no instruction about that. And it's only when you get later on in Leviticus that you learn that not only that when you have to offer these offerings, but the order in which you should offer them. Can I kind of shake it up a little bit and maybe offer a grain offering by itself and then come back and offer a trespass offering? Just want to vary the liturgy a little bit. No, you can't do that. There's an order of the way things are supposed to be done, but you don't know that at the beginning of Leviticus. You're just given instruction about these different discrete offerings, and you don't see them actually in action until you get to Leviticus 8 and 9. That's significant I'll just give a hint of why it's significant. It's significant because Leviticus 8 and 9 are about the ordination of priests. The first time you see purification offerings and ascension offerings and peace offerings actually being enacted is in the ordination of the priests. So that gives us a hint that there's something about the offerings that links to priesthood and links to installation in priesthood or restoration of priesthood. And I think we see that filled out in the rest of Leviticus. Offerings are rites in part to establish priestly status, but we get a hint of that by thinking ahead. You need to read Leviticus 1, Leviticus 4, all the rest of the sacrificial system. You can't just stop there and think, I understand the sacrificial system. You have to move ahead to the priestly ordination, to the purity system, to other examples. Okay. Another example of what I'm talking about. I've mentioned that the peace offering is the center of the sacrificial system. That'll be the last of my pro tips. So I do have 5 pro tips, actually. The peace offering is the center of the sacrificial system, and the peace offering is the one offering that a lay Israelite, that is a non-priest, could eat from. Leviticus 3 is the one animal offering that non-priests could eat. The peace offering, right? But Leviticus 3 gives us the ritual for a peace offering, but says nothing about who eats it. The only thing about eating in Leviticus 3 is a prohibition of blood and fat. You can't offer blood, you can't eat blood, you can't eat fat. There's a food law at the end of Leviticus 3, but it's a negative food law. Don't eat those things. It's not until we get to Leviticus 7, which is the last chapter of the sacrificial instruction, that we learn how the peace offering is distributed. We learn that certain portions go to the priests and the rest of the animal goes to the worshiper so that he can eat it along with his other worshipers. So he can have a feast. But we don't know that at the beginning. So the peace offering legislation, when we first encounter it, is incomplete. And we only know what it means when we think ahead or read ahead to later parts of Leviticus. Okay. Pro tip number 3. Think integrally. What do I mean by that? That means we have a number of different factors that are necessary for a sacrifice, for the Levitical sacrifices to take place. And we don't understand what's going on in those sacrifices unless we integrate those different factors. If we just think about what's happening to the animal without thinking about how it affects the tabernacle, the sanctuary, or how the priests are involved, or how it affects the person, we just look at what's happening to the animal, we don't understand the sacrifice. The priest is involved in every sacrificial procedure. The worshiper is involved in every sacrificial procedure. So in order to understand how the sacrifices work, what they do, we not only have to think about what's happening to the animal, but who's doing what to the animal. And we also have to think about where it's being done, the tabernacle, and how it's being apportioned to different parts of the tabernacle. Yeah. Think of a good example of, let me suggest this as one example of thinking about the sacrifices integrally. There are no sin offerings even mentioned until we get to Sinai. Sin offerings are an innovation of the Mosaic system of worship. Why? Why did they come up there? What's the point of having sin offerings? Didn't people sin before that? Well, yeah. Did they offer sacrifice? Well, yeah, but they didn't offer this particular kind of sacrifice. There's something about the sin offering in relation to the establishment of the priests, the Aaronic priests, and in relation to the building of the tabernacle. Those three things arise together. Those are all innovations of the Mosaic order. You don't have a designated priestly clan anytime before before Mosaic era. You don't have certain kinds of sacrifices like the sin offering before the Mosaic era. And you don't have a tabernacle. And all the reason why all those things are introduced at the same time is because they go together. Sin offerings are designed, among other things, to purify and keep the house, the tabernacle, clean. That's why the blood of a sin offering is never put on a person. It's always put on the furnishings of the tabernacle. It's always put on an altar. Because it's designed not just, it is having an effect on the person, but it's also designed to make sure the house is clean. Why do I want the house clean? I've said this before. The house needs to be clean so that Yahweh doesn't leave. So the purification offering is introduced as a way of keeping the house clean, and the house is cleaned by priests. So the priests, the tabernacle, and these new offerings are all linked up together, and you have to think about the effect on the people, the person who's offering the sacrifice as well. Okay. This is one more comment before this. Rick Berry Jr., a Catholic Old Testament commentator in a recent book, points this out, that you have a whole thread of Old Testament scholarship that's spending enormous amount of time, rightly, trying to figure out the form and the furnishings of the holy place. You've got a whole nother thread that's dealing with the sacrificial system, and you have other people who devote their lives to studying the priests. But these tend to be specializations that are not integrated together. And that just leads to distortions because they're all interacting. They have to be interacting. Yeah, Michael. Yeah, I think that you do have occasions when blood is sprinkled on people or put on people. That's one occasion. We'll see in the ordination rite for priests that the priests have blood on their ear, their thumb, and their big toe on the right side of their bodies. So yeah, there's blood that's placed on people. The blood of the sin offering is never put on people. And I think you're right. The blood I think that's a covenant inauguration event, like Genesis 15. In some sense, like the priests, the ordination, that's establishment of the priestly order and arrangement. The blood that's sprinkled on the people in the covenant it's a founding event. Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, pro tip number 4. Get the terminology right. By that I mean we want to understand, we want to translate the terms that are used for the sacrificial system accurately. And of course, when I say that, there's the implied claim that many translations don't, and I'm not just applying that, I am asserting that. In many cases, the translations that were given for the offerings are not what the words themselves mean. The translations that are given are not arbitrary. There's reasons for the translation, but those translations don't actually reflect what the word means. And getting a translation that links to the Hebrew word, I think, is really helpful for understanding the liturgical import and the spiritual import of these various offerings. That's not the case with every offering, but it's the case with several of them that I want to talk about now. Leviticus 1 introduces the whole burnt offering, or the burnt offering. The Hebrew word is olah. The word olah in the Hebrew doesn't mean whole. It doesn't mean burnt. It doesn't mean offering. It's like the Holy Roman Empire, which is none of the three. Okay, that's a crack from Edmund Gibbon. It doesn't mean any of that. The word olah is from a verb Allah, which simply means to go up. It's a very, very common verb throughout the Old Testament. Anytime somebody climbs a mountain, he's Allahing the mountain. Every time Israel comes up out of Egypt, they Allah out of Egypt. They come up out of Egypt. It's used in more theologically rich context to describe ascents to God's presence or something like that. But it just means go up. One way to describe it would be the going up offering. That's kind of clumsy. What I've and others have come to is to describe it as an ascension offering. It's an ascension offering. The reason it's called a whole burnt offering is because the whole offering is burnt. That's what happens in the ritual of the whole burnt offering, of the first, of the ascension offering, the olah. So the reason why it's translated that way is translators look at what happens to the animal, and this is the one offering where the entire animal is placed on the altar, entire animal is turned to smoke. And so they derive the meaning, they translate the meaning of, they translate the word in terms of the ritual prescribed. Reasonable thing to do. But it doesn't actually reflect the language, the verb, what the word actually means. And I think it doesn't capture what the offering is doing. All of the offerings are offerings that are burnt. They're not all whole. That is distinctive. But this offering, because it's a whole burnt offering, because the whole animal is being burned, it signifies and liturgically enacts an ascension of the worshiper into the presence of God. The whole animal is turned to smoke in order to go up to God as pleasing aroma. Okay. So, and we'll see that idea of ascent is significant for understanding how the ascension offering is used in the rest of the sacrificial system. Chapter 2 of Leviticus talks about the grain offering. The Hebrew word for grain offering is mincha. The grain offering, why is it called the grain offering? Why is it translated that way? Well, because it's made of grain. Okay, that's obvious. It's the material that's being used in the offering. That's where the name comes from. That's not what the Hebrew word means, though. The Hebrew word doesn't have anything to do with grain. The Hebrew word means tribute. It's the word that's used when in the 2 Samuel, David conquers various lands around him, and the conquered kings bring minchot to him. They bring their tribute to acknowledge David as their overlord. They're vassals of David, and their gifts of mincha are an acknowledgement and representation of that. So a mincha is a tribute offering, I'm going to say. The shalem, or peace offering, that's a good translation. We can stick with that one. You can see, if you know any Hebrew at all, you know the word shalom, right? You use some version of shalom as a greeting, right? Yeah. So it's the same. It has the same root as shalom. It's a verb form. It's another noun form of shalom. And so peace is a good translation. I think it captures what the peace offering does and represents. The peace offering, again, is the one offering of all of the offerings that lay Israelites ate from. When they had festivals, Passover, and they offer sacrifices, and they eat, drink, and rejoice before the Lord at the Passover, or at the Feast of Pentecost, or at the Feast of Booths, what they're eating is peace offerings. Every time it talks about, it doesn't always say peace offering, but every time it talks in the Old Testament about the people of God gathering to eat, drink, and rejoice before the Lord, and to hold a feast before the Lord, that's the offering that's being made. It has to be. That's the only one that they can actually use as a meal. Okay, so that's a good one. The word for sin offering is chatat. Chatat, the word does mean sin, so I don't have an objection to that translation. The limitation of that translation, hard to capture this in a translation, so this is just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about or reading about the sin offering. If you are a woman, if you were, put it in the subjunctive because you're not. If you were hypothetically a woman and you had a baby, you would be impure, and you would have to bring, at the end of your period of impurity, purification, a sin offering. Could be a lamb, could be birds. There's accommodation made for the economic status of the offerer. If you can't afford a lamb, then you're given permission to bring birds instead. There's several places where that accommodation is made for the poor, so they can offer the offerings even when they can't afford to have the larger animal that would normally be offered. Now, if you call that a sin offering, does that mean that somehow she's sinned? How did she sin? What's that?
Leviticus say it's unclean.
It's unclean, right? It's impurity, but impurity and sin are not the same thing. So you can be impure without sinning, and you can't really sin without being polluted in some sense, but you can be impure without sinning. She hadn't done anything wrong. She didn't commit adultery. This is her husband's child. Bearing children is something God desires, and yet she's unclean and she has to offer a chatat as an offering. So to use the translation sin offering in that context is misleading. Some have proposed purification offering as a translation of this term. That misleads in the other direction, because sometimes sin offerings are required for sins, as I already read from Leviticus 4. If you sin and do anything contrary to the commands of the Lord, then you offer a sin offering. That's a chatat. So neither of those translations fully captures the significance of this. Sin offering is actually closer to the translation of the word. So if we're sticking to close translations of the word, we would use sin offering to translate it. So I'll keep that. But keep in mind when you thinking about the sin offering, don't be distracted by the translation and think if a sin offering is being offered, somebody must have sinned. That's not always the case. Okay. The guilt offering. The guilt offering translates asham. And that is, guilt offering is a legitimate translation of that term. The word means guilt. Sometimes means guilt not as an offering, but means guilt as what the objective status that you're in after you sin. You're guilty. But this is another case where the translation is legitimate of guilt offering, but you have to keep certain things in mind to distinguish the guilt, this offering, the asham, and to think about it properly. Not every sin requires a guilt offering. Every sin in a theological sense makes you guilty, but that doesn't mean you have to offer a guilt offering. Sometimes you have to offer a sin offering, a chatat rather than a asham. There are specific kinds of sins that require an asham, and they're sins of transgression, trespass, or sacrilege. So I've come to use the word trespass offering to capture that. A trespass offering or a compensation offering. A trespass is when you cross a boundary and invade something that you're not supposed to invade. A sin offering is given as an offering for sins that are inadvertent. At the beginning of Leviticus 4, it says that if you sin unintentionally and do something against the commandments of God, unintended sin, inadvertent sin, you can sin without intending to, according to Leviticus 4. It's an interesting insight on sin. It's a sin of wandering away. It's a sin of that it's perhaps you're something happens and you react without thinking and say something that's sinful, or you're confronted with something seductive and you have a lustful thought about something that crosses your feed on X or Facebook. That's a sin, but it's not something you planned ahead for, and it's not something that you indulge necessarily, but it's still a sin. That's an inadvertent kind of sin. That's one form of inadvertent sin. A trespass is something different. It's not wandering away, but it's aggressive and intrusive. You could describe the sins that are covered by the trespass offering as high-handed sins. Sins that are, or transgressions. Paul distinguishes between sins and transgressions in Romans 5. Adam committed a transgression. He was given specific specific rule and violated the rule. Israel committed transgressions because they were given a whole elaborate set of commandments, and they violated those explicit commandments. The rest of mankind are sinners, but they aren't transgressions because they haven't transgressed across, they haven't broken an explicit boundary. So trespass offerings, asham, are given for those kind of trespasses. Specifically, as we'll see, they have to do with sacrilege. Sacrilege is a particular kind of trespass when you trespass on holy space or trespass against holy things. To use examples I gave earlier in the day, if you grabbed a fork from the tabernacle and took it home and used it at your dinner table, that's a small-scale form of sacrilege because you're using something holy and you're using it for a common use. Or if you're not a priest and you've read about or heard about what's inside the holy place, but you really, 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 really want to see it. So when you're in the court one day, the priests are all occupied with something else. Say, I'm going to sneak in, take a peek. That's a trespass because that's some place you're not supposed to be. Or if you pick up some of the priest's food that's holy or most holy food that's designated specifically for priests, that's a trespass. That's a sacrilege because you've taken something that's holy and you're not a holy person. You've got to be a consecrated person, that is a priest, to have the holy food. And so you'd have to offer an asham. Okay. One last pro tip, and I'll start back here tomorrow because I have more to say than I can get in the next 7 minutes or 8 minutes. And that is that the sacrificial system is a peace system. It's a peace system. By that I mean, as I've already stated, that the peace offering is the central offering in the whole structure of sacrifices. The purification offering is an innovation of the Mosaic order. The trespass offering is an innovation of the Mosaic order. Nobody did those before the tabernacle was set up. Also, nobody had a peace offering until they got to Sinai. The first time we read about peace offerings is when Israel gathers at the foot of Sinai and they sacrifice peace offerings and they prepare for the Lord's appearance to them. And then the peace offerings get institutionalized into the Levitical system in the book of Leviticus. The peace offering is the festive offering of the Israelite system. And we can think again back to Eden. Eden is our touch point for everything. Everything. But it's our touch point for the sacrificial system. Adam could eat in the presence of God. Couldn't eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I think he was allowed to eat the tree of life. I think that's open to him. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is the only one that's excluded. He can eat from the tree of life. I don't think he did. But he's in the presence of God. He's given food that he can eat. The whole world is available for food except that one tree. That's how Genesis 1 ends, as an invitation to eat. Creation is a banquet hall where God offers food for his creatures. Okay. That's the conclusion of the creation account. Day 6 concludes with an invitation to food. Adam can eat in the presence of God. Then Adam is cast out of the garden. Nobody goes back into the garden. People eat and drink and have various kinds of festivities. When the Lord shows up at Abram's tent, Abram serves him, but doesn't sit down and have a meal with him. When Laban and Jacob form a covenant, as after Jacob leaves Laban, is on his way back to the land, Laban chases him down and they decide to have this non-aggression pact. Laban's going to stay where he is. Jacob's going to stay where he is. They're not going to interfere with each other. They seal that agreement by having a meal together. But it's not described as a meal in the presence of God. So I think from Adam in the garden until the tabernacle is set up, or until Sinai, and then the tabernacle, no one eats and drinks in the presence of God directly. You have various kinds of offerings. Abel and Cain offer mincha. Both the animal offerings of Abel and the grain offerings of Cain are used. The term is used to describes the grain offering in Leviticus 2, or the tribute offering. Noah offers ascension offerings, as does Abraham, but those are not meals. The ascension offering is the whole animal being burned and turned to smoke and ascend to the Lord. Those are sacrifices, but you don't have a sacrifice that you eat and drink, that you eat in the presence of God. You don't have a feast in the presence of God until you get to Sinai, until after the Exodus, until God is entering into this new covenant. So it's an innovation of the system. And I think everything in the system is designed to ensure that the peace offering continues. Why offer chatat, sin offerings? So that the house stays clean. Why do you want the house clean? So Yahweh stays there. You offer chatat because you want to be clean. If you become unclean, sometimes you have to offer a chatat. Why do you want to offer a chatat? Why do you need to do that? So that you can be clean enough to go into the presence of God. And what do you do when you get there? You have peace offerings. Okay. So the chatat is introduced to ensure that the peace offerings can be enjoyed by the people of God. To use Thomistic language, the language of Thomas Aquinas, the chatat, the purification or sin offering, is ordered to the peace offering. I think the trespass offering is the same. It's ordered to the peace offering. All these offerings are introduced together, but the peace offering is the central one. The reason for the other offerings is because the peace offering needs to keep happening so that Israel can continue to eat and drink and rejoice in the presence of God. One last thing on this point, and then I'll close for the day. And that is, we talked about the Levitical system as a sacrificial system. From the verb for sacrifice or the noun for sacrifice. In Hebrew, the verb sacrifice has a more specific usage. Tzavak. 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 Probably should have it. Maybe a TS would be better. Tzavak. That's a V, not an R. Tzavak. Tzavak means to slaughter, but not invariably, but most frequently, almost invariably, it's slaughter in preparation for a meal. You zavak sacrifices, you zavak, and then the noun form is zavak, which I can't remember. But you slaughter things so that you can have a meal. Zavak doesn't just mean kill, it means basically butcher. You prepare something for a meal. So that's the basic term for sacrifice, the word that's translated most consistently as sacrifice in the Pentateuch. And it's specifically referring to a meal sacrifice, preparation for a meal. It's specifically referring to the peace offering. Later on in the Old Testament, you'll find festivals where they offer sacrifices and burnt offerings and sacrifices. The word sacrifice there is just an alternate term for the peace offering. So if we call it a sacrificial system, I think that's a legitimate thing to say it. Mentally translate that into Hebrew and think, well, sacrifice means slaughter for a meal. If this is a sacrificial system, it means the whole system is set up so that people can eat and drink in the presence of God. It's a peace system. So that Israel can be at peace, the image of peace between men, creation, and God is the feast. Creation is properly being used for human enjoyment. Human beings are sharing food together as they should, becoming one body, one people by sharing food. Sharing one loaf, they become one body, and they are being united to God in this feast because it's done in His presence. 5 o'clock.